So here's a summary. First is Australia is not among the best practice defined contribution systems when judged on the basis of cost. Second, policy settings do have a strong influence on costs and efficiency. The third point is that stronger super will not lower fees very much. I've got a couple of slides on other systems that achieve lower fees while preserving choice, and then finally a few observations about how a tender might work. From Grattan's point of view, we 100% share the perspective that members' interests are paramount in the superannuation system. That means some risk-adjusted net return over people's careers and through their retirement, leading to an appropriate provision for retirement income has to be core in the ultimate objectives of the superannuation system. And fees are only a component of that. Fees are only just one driver of those net returns. This first chart shows Australia's APRA reported costs in the context of a broad set of countries internationally. Now, as has been heavily sort of emphasised by a number of participants in the debate, there are issues with that international data, and both because the systems vary and because the cost attribution does vary from country to country. But I think there's no question that given our scale, Australia could be expected to have a better cost ratio if our system design permitted that, and that is fundamentally what we explored in the report. We didn't say that we felt it was appropriate for Australia to shift back towards DB. The bulk of what we focused on was how to get a better deal in our current DC system. Many settings affect systems cost and efficiency, and I've put up what to my mind are the main components. The supply side around regulation, trustee duties, fragmentation in the industry, vertical and horizontal integration. In the middle, you can see product design, system design, disclosure, investment styles, investment practices, distribution and advice practices are all critically important to cost and efficiency, and then administration also matters. Critically as well, how the demand side operates really matters. And I think if you look at the Australian system, there's been work over decades developing protocols in each of these areas, and there's a whole range of views about what more can be done in each of these. Our report focused quite strongly, I guess, on the proposition that you can do more on the demand side, and I'll take you through some of that thinking. But at a high level, when you think about how system design affects costs and efficiency, it's important to think of three broad ways in which that might occur. The first is that by mandating product features such as including insurance or a high level of portability, additional features are created that obviously are costly to provide. The second is that by mandating activities such as reporting, directly mandated costs are imposed on the industry. But there's a third really important category, and that is that system design affects the way that the different pieces interact. And to put it bluntly, it changes the shape of competition in the sector. And that's what I'm going to focus on in my interpretation of what we see in the data. So a first important point is that the superannuation cost curve has shifted up over the last decade. So this is in constant dollars, or in fact it's in percent of funds under management, so it's not affected by inflation. You would have expected, as the average fund increased in size from about 600 million to 4 billion or so over those 9 years, that there would have been about a $2 billion dividend per year coming out of that increase in scale. But that scale dividend has been fully absorbed by increases at cost in each scale. That's probably a function in part of the increased regulatory costs associated with the introduction of stronger super and so forth. But we believe there's also been a significant contribution to that increase in cost from the changing choice environment that has driven many funds to increasingly have to build the capability to respond to the intensification of competition. Funds compete on multiple dimensions. They compete on fees, obviously, but they also compete on non-fee propositions, the breadth of the product range, member engagement, the investment platform, and obviously in the case of the retail funds, they compete through their distribution networks as well. And then all funds compete on the basis of marketing. And those things do tend to drive cost in the industry, and we believe that that has been an important component in the increase in the cost at each scale. We reflected quite deeply, I think, on the driver of this exceptionally broad spread of fees that one observes in the Australian industry. Now, it's not that different as a spread from what you would see in the 401ks in the US. And combined with the work that I'm going to show you about the relationship between fees and net returns, we conclude that the most natural interpretation of this large observed spread in fees is that the demand side is not effective in driving for the most risk-adjusted, return-effective products to be gaining share rapidly at the expense of products that are fundamentally less attractive products. And so you see this persistence in essentially suboptimal products being held in the market. And that's associated with a range of other inefficiencies, which I'll touch on too, in relation to a lack of pressure on scale in the system. But obviously, there's the price distribution is topped out by the retail sector, where the distribution networks have driven high cost, and there's a number of other factors there as well. And then you have this relatively low cost combination of public sector and corporate funds right down at the bottom, with the industry funds in the middle. So that's all well known, but it's just worth really reflecting on what is driving that distribution to persist over the years. Just waiting for the next slide to appear. So what we've charted here is on the horizontal axis, funds under management, and on the vertical axis, expenses reported to APRA and fees, where we could match them up. And you can see that for the not-for-profit space, there's a broad spread of reported expenses, and that list fees for the most part are fairly similar to those expenses. And again, just to reflect on what is causing that persistent difference, that distribution in the low cost, around 50 basis points, up to a set of relatively high cost not-for-profit funds with APRA reported expenses of about 100 basis points. Just to reflect on, would you expect a market in which value for money was really driving the industry, would you expect that persistence to be observed? Now, this is the same chart, but for the retail sector. So you can see first that list fees often strongly exceed the expenses that are reported to APRA, and that there's a much bigger spread in APRA reported expenses, between 50 basis points again up to over 150. And again, just reflecting on what is it in the industry that is permitting these differentials to preserve. And one explanation would be, well, there's a lot of variations in product characteristics, and that's what you would expect in any market, just like in the auto market. And I'll come back to the relationship between fees and performance in just a second, but just to remind people in the room, as I'm sure we're all aware, that holding other things equal, fees really can be very material. So a 1 percentage point difference in fees per year will correspond to about a 20% difference in balances at retirement. And of course, it's a bigger difference in incomes through retirement, because accumulation in the fund matters. Now, this is our cut. It's only for 7 years of the relationship between fees and net returns in the funds that we've just shown. And you can see that there's a strong tendency for, this is after inflation, net returns to be really strongly lower amongst the funds with higher fees. If you strip out, so that includes both admin and investment fees, the relationship is much less strong, but it's still positive if you just look at the investment fee impact. And so that suggests that some investment models with higher fees are generating they're essentially washing their face. They're generating sufficient returns to pay their own way. But still there's a tail where that hasn't been the case over this particular period. Now that's a short period, it was a fairly broad product set, and more work needs to be done over the longer term. But I would say that a number of studies have found similar results in aggregate for earlier time periods in super. I mentioned 401ks, you see the same impact in the world of 401ks, that the high fee 401ks generate worse net returns on a risk-adjusted basis. And I won't go through our risk adjustment. Now let me just turn to one of the big drivers of change in the industry has been the introduction of stronger super. This chart is not FUM weighted. We just purchased from Plan for Life their FUM weights on my super. Obviously below the 1% is most of the industry, corporate and public sector funds. And then there's a right-hand tail with relatively small FUM at the moment of the retail funds. So we think that the statements that you might have heard around MySuper having dropped average fees by 20 basis points, probably not the case, because the FUM in the retail sector is just not big enough to make that impact, but we haven't completed the research on that. So we think that there has been a positive impact, but it hasn't been very large, and it's obviously also been associated with the shift towards passive management amongst some of the retail fund providers. Not-for-profit funds don't seem to be cutting default fees at all. This is FUM weighted, it's not the full universe, it's what we could pull out of our data set. And as I said, there has been some fall in retail funds, but it hasn't been a very large fall. Let me just keep plugging along because I want to meet my 15 minutes. So I started with the claim that reform on that left-hand panel, reform on the demand side, can make a big difference to fees in the system. And there are a couple of models that we've got on the left and in the middle of the screen. On the left, government-run defaults can achieve very, very low fees. Now, the institutional environment varies hugely. The US Thrift Savings Plan is for armed forces and federal employees. They've got extremely efficient administration, single employer essentially, and then they farm out very, very large tranches for wholesale management. There's a limited set of options, but there is investment choice. Sweden's AP7 default achieves what looks to us like a combination of low fees with actually very, very aggressive investment management in the early part of people's life cycle. And then, of course, through the Swedish vehicle, there's a very broad range of choice. They've got some interesting admin centralisation as well. UK Nest is a very nascent product, but again, appears to be targeting relatively low fees. The Chilean story's got quite a lot of press. Essentially, what's done there is that a tender is operated, and I'll take you through a little bit more the detail there. Then you can see on the right, if there's less attention allocated to fees through the demand side, then the price realisation can differ. Mexico allocates default based on previous performance. New Zealand has got a balanced scorecard. They've been critiqued for having an asset allocation that is too safe in their defaults. And then, of course, we all know Australia, and you can see we've asserted that there's an average default fee of about 90 basis points currently, all up. So just quickly on Chile, the tender process was introduced in 2010. It only applies to the front book for new accounts, but you do have to apply your price to your back book, and so what's tended to happen is smaller firms have won that tender. They're performing better than the others, but they really haven't done anything to the back book. But it's clear you can get very aggressive results. This is the contribution fee only. There's an additional investment management fee of about 30 basis points for externally provided investment management, which we actually missed in our first report. So the all-up fees are equivalent to about, I think it was around 50 basis points. So it's been quite an aggressive outcome as a result of that. And again, they've got roughly the same asset allocation. So if you were to run a tender quickly, and I should wrap up, essentially one way to do it would be to have a highly fee-focused tender, and if you want to do that, you need to be quite prescriptive about the product categories that are going to be eligible, including the asset allocation, because obviously otherwise you'll end up all in cash. And so that would, and what I've set out here is a set of dimensions on which such a tender would need to be done. But the other way to do it would be to look at the Fair Work process that's operated or could be operated today, or look at the way corporates run tenders today. It's a more of a multi-dimensional arrangement of the type that New Zealand does. And I guess our fundamental proposition is that there are quite a lot of people who at the moment are falling between the cracks. They don't have a BHP or a Woolworths or an award going into bat for them. And so that's why you see this kind of right-hand tail of the distribution of returns. And there'd be one way to run the tender actually would be to put a strong emphasis on previous performance. You tend to have incumbents winning that, but as a result, you would essentially invite some of these new flows into the best performing existing funds today, and so thereby you put strong consolidation pressure on the industry. Excuse me, I'm going the wrong way. And aggressively, if you thought you could replicate the admin cost of the largest not-for-profit funds of around 20 basis points, and then if you had a predominantly passive investment approach, your fees could be about 20 basis points. If the judgment was that you didn't want to go passive, because that obviously limits your exposure to certain asset classes, then your fee would be higher. But in any event, the potential prize could end up being significant. So that's the high-level story, but again, I'm just aware I'm slightly over and that the discussion is going to be valuable. Thank you.
I'm with Jim, believe it or not. I want lower fees. I want lower fees for your members, for me as a member, and I want competition. Do you know, according to the numbers that Jim has in his report, only 2% of the total membership move from one fund to another. And I think anyone in this room who is interested in doing better and being rewarded for the success of having good returns, better product, we want greater competition in this industry. Now, I'm not going to talk about Jim's report. I think there's been a lot in the public eye about reflecting that report, but there are three things that I would like to discuss today. The first is about the question of active and passive investment management and the element of fees in relation to that. I'd like to talk a little bit about where competition actually is in the provision of superannuation. And thirdly, I'd like to propose a different model to the Chilean model, which I think can help us on this course to actually increase competition within the industry. First, I'd like to talk about active and passive. And it's very easy to make the assumption that the average investor can't beat the index, and therefore we should be passive. In my view, that is an extremely lazy attitude and way of thinking about investment. It's like saying that the average AFL team can never be better than ninth, so why compete in a competition? In the same way that Jim says that a 1% reduction in fees could improve members' retirement performance by 20%, a 1% increase in performance on investment management will increase the benefits for members by 20%. And can it be done? I saw some, just to be fair, I saw some report by Russell Clark on Mercer. He estimates that their selection of managers over the last 10 years has delivered 1% per annum outperformance. In the case of REST, which I can talk about, over the last 10 years, outperformance of the passive returns by 1.3% per annum over 10 years. In Australian equities over the last 12 years, outperformance by 3.2%. In global equities, 2.3%. in Jana's experience, I put this slide up, 327 mandates over 15 years, no survivorship bias, outperformance by 1.3% on Australian equities and global equities managers. Active investment, there is a whole lot of reasons we should think about active investment, but it is so easy for policymakers to take the lazy attitude, the lazy approach that on average you can't beat the index, maybe. But for those who can, the returns for members are enormous, and we shouldn't let the debate go down the lazy route. The second point I'd like to talk about is about competition, and I will be the first to say that there is very limited price-based competition in this industry. But there is an enormous amount of competition in the industry itself. If any of you have been involved in a corporate tender, you will know how competitive it is on services and how competitive it is on price. This structure of fund expenses from APRA lists what the costs are. The provision of admin is extremely cost competitive. Insurance is cost competitive. In the case of REST, 2 million members, $30 billion of assets and a staff of 120. I want to know where you could find fat in the system which is run in this particular way. The other area of competition is of SMSFs. 30% of our industry is now being managed individually by people themselves. It is interesting, I would doubt that you'd find many industries with such a degree of carried out by individuals themselves. And it really is an element of competition. But taking this own chart, the self-managed costs are only a skerrick below what is the industry fund costs. And these are people who have made an active decision to take the money out of one form of institutionalised system into their own. So it's not, again, it can't be about the fat in the system, I don't believe. It may well be about the structure, Jim. But even in self-managed, where's the fat there? My third area that I'd like to cover is about an alternative approach, perhaps, rather than a fundamental restructure of how super is managed here in Australia. To get to this stage, I want to take you along my line of thinking about why we haven't seen price-based competition here in Australia. And until we really understand why there isn't price-based competition, it's very hard to address what the right model should be. My view is that there is this lack of price-based competition is because we are not buying a commodity. We are buying something into the future, not just next year, but 20, 30 and 40 years into the future. And also we know that the world is uncertain. So we're not buying a packet of Wheaties it's not a commodity, not buying something off the supermarket shelf today. We're buying a service, and a service that we don't really know what's going to be out in the future. Buying on the basis of price just doesn't cut it. People aren't going to buy their future retirement future on the basis only of price. It will be on the basis of trust, on the basis of reputation, and I suspect on the basis of brand. That that is the money, that is the trade in our industry: brand, reputation, and trust. So if we want to get more competition in the game, we've got to focus less on price and more on what is being delivered and what people will trust to be delivered. I am very, very nervous about schemes to totally restructure the Australian system. Not only because we've had so much change already, but I'm very nervous about having a change system that concentrates power in a very few hands, which I think is what could happen or what is happening in some of those countries you've mentioned. The concentration of power leads to the risk of political interference. It leads to the greater risk of corruption, in my view, the lack of flexibility, and when you make change, there are costs with change, and those costs will get borne by the members. So rather than try and have a model which totally restructures our super system, I think what we need to do, and if you agree with me that we want more competition in this industry, then it is a sum of a number of small parts of change. And for the sake of today's presentation, I'll give 6 areas that we should focus on to continue to improve our performance and our scope for competition. The first is we should challenge the extent of regulation and imposition of those costs on our members. I don't know what the number is, but I would guess that the cost of Stronger Super to the industry is somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. No wonder we haven't had the benefit of consolidation going to the member. It has gone to into the regulatory process. Now, every regulation on its own stands up, but in total, we have developing a very costly and expensive system, and it needs to be challenged. I'm not saying it's wrong, it needs to be challenged because it is an increasing impost generally on the returns that members get. Number 2, the pressure on investment management fees. I had worked in my previous role in trying to push harder and harder on reducing the investment management fees that super funds typically pay in this industry. We've had some success, but the game has to keep on going. There is certainly a large amount of rent that is captured by the investment managers, which should be negotiated and forced that rent back into the hands of the people whose money it actually is. Internalisation of investment management in Australia is going to make a big difference in that regard. Thirdly, there are those in the community who talk about that super funds shouldn't advertise. Why are they advertising? This is a mandated system. But if you believe, as I am coming to believe, that competition is in the area of brand, reputation and trust, then it will be important to communicate that area of brand, reputation and trust, because that will be the source of how members become more and more aware of what they're actually buying. Fourthly, I think there will need to be ongoing and more serious sanctions for those trustees that breach the trust of members. Now, of course, that relates to matters such as inappropriate conflicts and managing them improperly, but I think it will also extend to those who breach the promise of delivering returns over a period of time. And I think APRA is heading in that direction. Fifth, I think we still need, as an industry, to iron out the issues about comparison of returns, the comparison of fees. It seems that there are, if we all want competition, we must have an even basis on which to compare one fund against another. And finally, I think that there is a role for third-party assessment, relative assessment of the different funds in this industry about what they have to offer. Are members getting value for service? We have a number of parties who do that in Australia. Whether they are independent enough to do the job properly, I think is an open question. And it is something that we can push further in that regard. Thank you.